Okay, everyone, let's get started. So today we're going to be picking up where we left off. This week's lecture is going to be called Reconciling Religion and Science. This is going to be part one. There's going to be a part two that'll be next week. In this part, we're going to start off with Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers. There will be a revised schedule. I apologize for these revisions. Due to COVID, this class was, accelerated as far as the time putting it out there for you. So because of this, sometimes I can only see so far as my headlights. So I'm constantly revising things. And the one thing that I didn't want to do is to rush through the material and to give you a superficial understanding of Islamic intellectual history. I'm a big critic of much of the material that's out there on the internet, on YouTube, when it comes to philosophy and theology. I think it's way too superficial. And the only way to get a proper understanding is to take the time to actually delve into the material. So that's why I wanted to do this topic justice. So that's why I even split this lecture into two. And so next week in lecture 8, we're going to pick up where we left off. And we're going to talk about miracles and evolution. This will be part 2 of Reconciling Religion and Science. There'll be no class the following week because I'll be working. But then lecture 9 will pick up on Tuesday, June 23rd, same time as today. The title is to be announced, but it'll probably be related to Islamic humanism, political philosophy, etc. I'm very aware of the fact that many courses on Islamic intellectual, or a lot of material on Islamic intellectual history kind of after Ghazali, after that period, just pretty much skips 1,000 years and goes to the modern period, as if nothing intellectual happened in between. So I want to try to push back against that. I'll try to make lecture 9 address some of those issues, but I do admit that I myself am not quite an expert of that period. So I'll try to do the best I can, but I think there is a lot of interesting material to cover in lecture 9. Finally, in lecture 10, we will have a conclusion and open discussion. That means that we'll have to pick up with modern Islamic intellectual history in a follow-up class. I know that's not what I advertised, but I had to figure this out as I went. Hopefully you all can join us back in the modern period where we'll pick up. But this is kind of the revised schedule, what it will look like. So we'll finish by June, and then we'll try to get restarted again to cover the modern period again, so that you can have that broad overview of Islamic intellectual history. All right, before I begin, I do have a couple clarifications to make. I'm actually quite surprised when I teach this course and when I listen back to myself, how often I misspeak. And it gives me appreciation for public figures who do the same that I've been critical of, but now I realize that it's quite easy to misspeak, especially when you're kind of speaking off the cuff. And that's why actually it's important not to take whatever I say as like wahi. Don't take it as a textbook that what I say. Really, all I'm giving you is pointers and reminders. You can think of this as bookmarks. So I'm giving you bookmarks in your knowledge, and then you can refer back to them, and then you can go into deeper study yourself. So I do have a couple clarifications that I realize might cause some confusion. I did say in my lecture on Sufism that I have kind of a negative view of esoteric truths or esoteric truths. I want to clarify, I do believe that the Quran and scripture has deeper meanings. I guess my only pushback, what I meant to say actually was that I don't believe that, I'm skeptical of claims of unveiling or kashf, the idea that these deeper meanings are only accessible to certain individuals and not to others based on this kind of spiritual unveiling process. But I do believe that there are deeper meanings to texts. And I clarify that in this lecture because we will be talking about deeper meanings when it comes to some of the views of the Islamic philosophers. So I did want to clarify that. The second thing is I do need to clarify as well, when I said in my opening lecture about Ghazali's charitableness, we're going to talk about who Imam Ghazali was. I should probably backtrack a little bit on that. He was definitely charitable to an extent, but there are certain times in which I think he may have misattributed to the Islamic philosophers or not been as charitable as probably he should have been. And additionally, his book that he wrote on the views of the Islamic philosophers, Maqasid al-Falasifa, many scholars now think that, and I do too, think that that was actually written when he was actually sympathetic to their viewpoints. And then he kind of added on the introduction and the conclusion at a later point in time. And Ibn Rushd, his adversary, will actually hint to the same kind of arguments. If none of this made sense, don't worry, I'm going to talk about Ghazali and Ibn Rushd shortly. But before I go any further, I think it would be tone deaf of me if I don't talk about a little bit what's going on right now. It's quite sad what's going on. I wanted to see if the chaplain was here. I know we changed the time. So what we'll do is this. We will circle back to this, what's going on with George Floyd, and at the end of the lecture, maybe the chaplain will join us. I feel like he would speak to it better than I could. And then that way we don't have to cut the discussion either. So I'll just keep moving on and we'll circle back to this. Some necessary disclaimers. Again, I'm not affiliated to the Ghamidi Center, and these what I say here and does not necessarily reflect the views of the Ghamidi Center or those of Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamidi. Again, this is a broad survey course in which we're approaching the material in an academic manner. A specific point, I am generally sympathetic to the views of the Islamic philosophers, but I am also critical of at least some aspects of their thought. Overall, however, I think adding them into the mix, that is our contemporary thinking, will only increase our ability to address contemporary issues. I think it's just one more tool that we can put in our tool belt to preserve religion in a time of science, atheism, and irreligion. That's just my personal viewpoint. I just ask that you keep an open mind. And on that note, I actively eschew the saved sect mentality. My own thought is eclectic and draws upon a diverse range of thinkers and groups. So I'm going to be sharing with you Ghazali's viewpoints and his adversary Ibn Rushd, but I think Ghazali has a lot of good points and Ibn Rushd has a lot of good points. So I think it's perfectly plausible that we can take benefit from both figures or all the different figures that are in this kind of debate that's going on. All right, broadly speaking, what we're seeing in this course, or at least how this course has unfolded, has been that we see this ongoing battle between Islamic traditionalism and rationalism. We see three figures here in this picture that really represent those two trends, and then the person in the middle kind of represents a trend of trying to reconciling these two trends. So on the, we see on the, I guess this would be on your left, would be Ibn Taymiyyah. He represents the strict group of Islamic traditionalists. On the right side, you see Ibn Rushd or Averroes. He represents the rationalists, the Islamic philosophers. And in the middle group, you see Imam Ghazali, who represents a group that can be considered the semi-rationalists, the Ash'aris, who are trying to reconcile between the traditionalists and the rationalists. And in fact, I should probably have inverted this. We should have had Ibn Rushd on the left side and Ibn Taymiyyah on the right side so that we could think about it that way. This is a really short but nice book if you wanted to read about Islamic history through this lens of this battle between traditionalism and rationalism. Now, with any kind of narrative or lens that you use, there are always going to be scholars who will problematize it. And this definitely has certain problems with viewing history in this way. But I find it to be a useful read so you can see history through this battle between traditionalism and rationalism. All right. Again, we're going to do some review now. So there are four major groups that we've discussed so far. Hanbalis, they represent the traditionalists, Ahl al-Hadith. They are the textualists. They claim orthodoxy, and we can kind of consider them the Sunni uber-orthodoxy. They really don't see reason in, they have kind of a jaundiced view towards reason. So I put this equation here. Reason for them is far less than revelation. That's not to say that they don't believe in using reason at all, but they really minimize it and kind of even look askance at it. So reason kind of can lead you astray. They tie reason to whims and one's passions. So they really want to minimize that as far as approaching religion is concerned. And I also put certain figures that represent this early trend. So we have Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Now that's it. You might ask me, well, why did you put Imam Shafi'i? Isn't he the founder of the Shafi'i madhab? Remember, there's a difference between a legal school and a theological or a school of Aqidah. From a theological sense, Imam Shafi'i was really in the same group as the Hanbalis. He was a textualist. And then, of course, we have Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. This is in the early period. In the medieval period, which we're going to be discussing today, we're going to see that Ibn Taymiyyah really picks up that baton of Islamic traditionalism. And in the modern period, we have the Wahhabis or the Salafis. And then you can kind of think of Saudi Arabia. They're the ones who are picking up this legacy. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are kind of the mutation of this trend of thought. I don't think it's fair to just say the Hanbalis are just Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but they are definitely mutations of this kind of thinking. In the United States, you can kind of think of Al-Maghrib Institute and Yasser Qadi as representing this Hanbali school of thought. And I'm specifically mentioning people in the United States so that this knowledge becomes practical to you. I don't mean to put somebody in a box. That doesn't mean that Yasser Qadi is not an original thinker of his own on his own merits, but I'm just trying to tell you what background people are coming from so that you can more intelligently engage in these debates that happen today. The second major group are the Asharis. They are the semi-rationalist theologians. They are Sunni orthodoxy. They believe that reason is still less than revelation, but notice I only put one less than sign. So they have a kind of higher viewpoint of reason, but they still put it below revelation. Imam al-Ashari is the eponymous founder of this school. In the medieval period, Imam Ghazali is the one who represents this trend of semi-rationalism. And we're going to discuss Imam Ghazali in this lecture. And then in the modern period, you have Al-Azhar University, which is the Ashari institution. Yusuf al-Qaradawi is a representative of this school of thought. And in the US, you have Zaytuna College, you have Hamza Yusuf. This is representing the Ashari school of thought. Then you have the Mu'tazilis. These are the rationalist theologians. These are the Ahl al-Arrai. They place reason and revelation, they place them on equal footing. They believe both are important, they go hand in hand. In the medieval period, we talked about Qadi Abdul Jabbar. We briefly talked about him in our discussion on Islamic rationalism, our lecture on Islamic rationalism. In the modern period, it's a lot more vague who the Mu'tazili, so the Mu'tazilis actually die off around the time that we're discussing, the medieval period. But they're kind of picked up as a symbol, either directly or indirectly. They're the inspiration for Islamic modernists, who we're going to discuss in the follow-on to this course on modern Islamic intellectual history. And then finally, we have the Falasifa, or the Islamic philosophers. These are also rationalists. We can kind of think of them as the uber rationalists. They actually place reason above revelation. And the early representative of these we talked about in our lecture on Islamic philosophy. It's okay if you don't remember their names. Al-Kindi is kind of the founder, then Al-Farabi. Remember, that's what we talked about, all those celestial intellects and that kind of cosmology. In the medieval period, it's Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the West, and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, who are most prominent. And these are the two figures that we're going to be discussing in this lecture. We briefly did talk about Ibn Sina, but we're going to really go into it in depth today. And in the modern period, it's also very vague who follows this trend. They also die off, so to speak, in Islamic history, but then they're picked up again as inspiration by certain Islamic reformists and modernists. All right, so all these four groups are going to engage in a royal rumble, and this is what we're going to see in this lecture. So who's player one in this royal rumble that's going to happen? It's Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. He is an Islamic philosopher from modern-day Uzbekistan. In the words of Peter Adamson, he's the single most influential medieval philosopher. He's saying not only in the Islamic world, but in the world in general. In fact, remember we talked about the paradigms of science. We said that there was the Aristotelian paradigm, then the Newtonian paradigm, and finally the Einsteinian paradigm. Well, actually in the Islamic world, after Avicenna, Ibn Sina, I'm going to be using these names interchangeably. Avicenna is simply the Latinization of Ibn Sina. But after Ibn Sina, Aristotelian science really becomes Avicennan science. That's how profound his influence is. And remember, Ibn Sina is famous for his argument from contingency. This is a proof for the existence of God. We talked about this in a previous lecture. Who's player number 2 in this fight? Well, it's Al-Ghazali. He was a theologian. That is, he was a kalam scholar, a mutakallim. He was from Khorasan, which is modern-day Iran. And he really comes to define Islamic or Sunni orthodoxy. He was given the title of Hujjat al-Islam, or proof of Islam. He studied Islamic theology, law, philosophy, and Sufism. He himself was an Ash'ari. That's by creed. By theology, he was Ash'ari. He was a Shafi'i as far as Islamic law is concerned, legal school is concerned. And finally, he was a Sufi by his tariqah. And in fact, this kind of trifold, this 3 elements to someone's belief and practice, this is something that Ghazali really synthesizes together. And after that, Islamic orthodoxy will always try to say that the proper route is to have be either Ash'ari or Maturidi in creed. Maturidism, as we discussed in a previous lecture, is very similar to Ash'arism. We're not going to really discuss it. So you pick you pick either the Ash'ari or Maturidi creed, which are very similar. At least they've become very similar. Then you pick one of the 4 madhabs to follow as far as law is concerned. That's Shafi'i, Hanbali, Hanafi, etc. And then you also pick a Sufi tariqah to follow. And that's what really defines Islamic orthodoxy. And this synthesis is done by Imam Ghazali at the turn of the, what would we call that, the millennium, at the turn of the millennium. Ghazali is famous for the Kalam cosmological arguments. We talked about this. Now, he wasn't actually the one who kind of put it forward. In the Islamic world, the one who put it forward first was a Mu'tazili, and then Al-Kindi also did. But Ghazali really kind of formulates it in a very developed manner, and that's why it's kind of picked up again in the modern period by a Christian theologian, William Lane Craig, and that's why it's been given this title of Kalam cosmological argument and has become very famous. He also argued that the best proof for the existence of God is actually mystical experience or gnosis with God, with the divine. That is experiential knowledge of the divine. And his kind of most famous text, he has many of them. He was just like Ibn Sina, he wrote many, many texts. But one of them is The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Al-Ihya. It's a multi-volume text. I strongly recommend all of you to pick this up. It's been translated. There's a beautiful translation of it. Pick it up, read some of it. It's quite profound text. And no matter where you are on the spectrum, I assure you that you will find much in it of value. All right, so we've talked about the first 2 players. There was Ibn Sina, Avicenna, then there was Ghazali, and now who's player number 3? That's Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. He too is an Islamic philosopher. So Ghazali writes The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In response, Ibn Rushd writes The Incoherence of the Incoherence. So that's a play on words there. And believe it or not, there was then another person who wrote The Incoherence of the Incoherence of the Incoherence. And this goes on and on, so it gets a little bit tiresome. Now, Ibn Rushd was a philosopher, a physician, a jurist, and a judge in Andalusia, that is modern-day Spain, under the Al-Mawrid dynasty. He was introduced to the Al-Mawrid Caliph by Ibn Tufail. Ibn Tufail is another Islamic philosopher. We're going to briefly look at Ibn Tufail's work. Probably not in this lecture, but in the next one. But just think of Ibn Tufail as an ally of Ibn Rushd. So if Ibn Rushd is player number 3, Ibn Tufail is sometimes taking over the controller. Now, Ibn Rushd is so popular in the Latin West that he's comes to be known as simply as the commentator. That is, the works of Aristotle are introduced back into the Latin West. And they are introduced back through the translations and commentaries that are Arabic, and the primary commentator is Ibn Rushd. And so he is also the inspiration for rationalism in the Latin West, and there is even a movement called Averroism in the Latin West that's loosely tied to the ideas of Ibn Rushd. They do kind of go in a different direction, but that just shows you how influential Ibn Rushd was in the Latin West. He is less influential in the Islamic world, and this point is often used by certain Muslims today, Islamic traditionalists today, who want to kind of detract from Ibn Rushd's legacy. But I think it's worthwhile to point out that one of the reasons why he is less influential is that even though he came to attack Ghazali, one would think that he's coming to the defense of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, but in reality, he's kind of saying, look, the reason why Ghazali is so critical of the Islamic philosophers is because he's criticizing Ibn Sina. But Ibn Sina, Avicenna, went off script and deviated from Aristotle's true message. And so Ibn Rushd is actually trying to go back to the true Aristotelian science. And so, but the point here that I'm trying to make is that one of the reasons why Ibn Rushd was not as influential in the Islamic world was not just because his ideas were somehow marginal or too radical. No, the real reason was Ibn Sina, his views were so influential and his shadow was so long that Ibn Rushd didn't really have that much influence in comparison to it. So again, he was an Aristotelian purist. So we often think of Ibn Rushd as this kind of uber rationalist, and he was a rationalist. But he was also in some ways a conservative if we think of Aristotelian science. He thought that Ibn Sina had kind of gone off script from pure Aristotelianism, and Ibn Rushd is trying to bring it back on track. And Ibn Rushd is kind of popular for his teleological argument for the existence of God. That is an argument from design. We're not going to discuss that in today's lecture, but you're seeing that all of these figures in Islamic history are making these philosophical proofs for the existence of God. Here is a portrait by Raphael, the Ninja Turtle, in the 16th century. And you see that in this portrait, that's a Renaissance portrait, Ibn Rushd is actually in this portrait, in this painting, where they're celebrating these philosophers and great thinkers. And they're in that kind of, I blew it up there on the right side, you see a picture of Ibn Rushd. Again, he is celebrated along with Ibn Sina in the Latin West. Here's a funny comic that I found where you see Ghazali, Ibn Rushd hearing that Ghazali wrote this book, and then Ibn Rushd says, oh yeah, I'm going to respond to this. And so you see that they're both kind of responding back and forth to each other. I think if it was today, it would be on online forums, but back then it was by books. And so we do have a question by Nadim. I'll read out the question. Was Ibn Rushd's influence less because he was less original than Ibn Sina in his philosophical work? I don't think so. I think even Ibn Sina can be thought of as working on material that came before him, like Al-Farabi. Perhaps Ibn Sina was more systematic and had a lot more works out there. But I wouldn't say that Ibn Rushd was any more or less original. I do think Ibn Rushd was actually less radical from a religious standpoint. So Ibn Taymiyyah, who we're going to talk about, was critical of the Islamic philosophers. And he did say that of the Islamic philosophers, Ibn Rushd was the least bad, basically. But let's keep going. Here's a funny image that I found on the internet. Memes, you gotta love the internet. So I think this should be a good mind map for you. So you see that Ibn Sina is being targeted by Al-Ghazali, and then Ibn Rushd responds back by firing against Al-Ghazali. And then in the back, you have Ibn Taymiyyah, who's going to take out everybody. This is kind of the mental map that you can see. And so let's talk about that fourth player, Ibn Taymiyyah. He's player number 4. He was a Hanbali jurist, a hadith scholar and theologian in the general sense of the word. What do I mean by that? Remember, the theologian, often we translate that as mutakallim or kalam scholar. He was opposed to kalam. But one of the things that we're seeing is that these words, we should be careful about translating them into English. So even though Ghazali wrote a book on the incoherence of the philosophers, Ghazali himself was a philosopher as we understand it today. He was definitely a philosopher. Similarly, similarly, the Islamic philosophers were theologians in the sense that we think of it today. They were all philosophers and theologians. They were all, many of them were jurists. These are kind of, we can think of these as group epithets. So we can either use theologian in a general sense, in which case Ibn Taymiyyah is a theologian, or we can use it in a specific sense, by which we mean a mutakallim or a kalam scholar. In that case, he's actually a critic of kalam or Islamic theology. I hope that makes sense. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, you've probably heard of Ibn Taymiyyah. You might even have heard of him in the news, because he's often cited for by some Western experts as the source of all Islamic terrorism, etc. Well, Ibn Taymiyyah was controversial in his time and still is today. He was a strict textualist, fundamentalist, maybe you could say, and quite polemical, zealous, and even impudent. That is, he was kind of rude at times. He is and was the inspiration for the later Wahhabi movement, that is the Salafis, and he is reviled, arguably for good reasons, by certain Sunni groups, including Sufis, of course by Shias and non-Muslims. That's because he came out so harshly against these groups. Even so, I would argue that one cannot deny that Ibn Taymiyyah was a profound, serious, and even courageous thinker at times. He also has some surprising fatwas that have been embraced by Islamic modernists and reformers. The point is, try not to put people into boxes and think that, everything about them is either good or bad. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, trust me, you read some of his stuff and you might be impressed. Here are some of Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas. So he had also a proof for the existence of God. And here's what I mean by a profound idea coming from Ibn Taymiyyah. I think his ideas on the fitra, which is the innate nature of the human being, I think this is quite profound. So he believes that we have intuitive knowledge of the divine. Now, moving forward, I think where he's kind of more controversial and where people tend not to like him is that he sought to, quote unquote, purify Islam against what he saw as blameworthy innovations, that is bid'ah, that he thought had crept into the religion. And he did have the view, I think it's fair to say, that anything foreign is by definition un-Islamic. Even Yasir Qadhi in his dissertation says as much. So I don't think that that is a unfair view to attribute to him. All right, so he did call to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And by the Sunnah, of course, he means the Hadiths. He isn't part of the Ahl Hadith, right? That is what he is calling back to. And he calls back to the understanding of the Salaf, that is the early generation of Islam. So you've probably heard these kind of slogans. They are inspired in part by Ibn Taymiyyah. And he did oppose taqlid or conformism, and he would say probably blind conformity to the four law schools or the madhahib, the madhabs. So you're going to see this kind of disagreement extend into the modern period between those two groups that are both claiming Islamic orthodoxy. On the one hand, we have the Islamic orthodoxy characterized by Al-Azhar University, the Asharis, and then on the other you have the kind of uber Sunni orthodoxy, which is the what you see in Saudi Arabia and by the Salafi brand, the Wahhabis, quote unquote. They are representing that other group of orthodoxy. They do have a disagreement when it comes to following four schools of thought. Now, the Hanbalis of Saudi Arabia, and this is contrary to what many people think, they do believe that following a madhab, a school of thought, is important for the average layperson. But they do think that if you become a scholar, you should follow, quote unquote, the evidence. That is, you should follow a textual report, most often a hadith, over what your law school says. Whereas many in the of the other kind of traditionalists will say, that is the Asharis and the Maturidis, especially, for example, on the subcontinent, this is a big debate that goes on. And in fact, on the Indian subcontinent, the Salafis or the Ahl Hadith, they have gone to an extreme of, whether you think it's an extreme in a negative sense or not is your viewpoint, but they actually don't believe in following a law school at all. But Ibn Taymiyyah himself, it is part of the Hanbali law school, but he is also more independent-minded, and he's often okay with taking a viewpoint outside of his madhab, and he starts this kind of trend. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah affirms God's attributes. We talked about this earlier. Remember that God has a face, hand, eyes. These are mentioned in the Quran. The mutakallimun, the kalam scholars, the theologians, are going to reject taking these literally. Ibn Taymiyyah is going to take that traditional Hanbali viewpoint and say that, no, we should accept these even though we don't ask how, bila kaif. This was the God has a face without howness, without saying how. And so he opposed kalam. He opposed the mutakallimun not only in their ideas, but even in the enterprise of theology, Islamic theology. He believed that if you engage in these debates, then you are basically opening yourself up to, even though you're saying that you're debating with non-Muslims and quote unquote deviant sects, you actually end up cross-fertilizing your beliefs with those other groups that you're debating with. And that can actually have a negative effect on your own beliefs. We're going to see that this is actually a very valid criticism. Now, whether it's positive or negative, that's up to you to decide. But we'll see it with Ghazali. He's going to be debating with Islamic philosophers. And Ghazali will actually absorb much of the thought of Islamic philosophy. So we're going to see that. So that is what Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism of Ghazali will be. All right. And then he also decried what he saw as shirk by Sufis and Shias, that is intercession, saint worship, visiting graves, etc. All right. And then we have a question by Mr. Hassan Osmani. Was Ibn Taymiyyah's attack on taqlid an attack on Shia theology, or just limited to conformity to 4 Sunni schools? So Ibn Taymiyyah was a very harsh critic of Shiism. So he would not even accept any Shia school of thought as being valid. But his critique, he's not a critic of following a school of thought. He's only saying that we use these as guideposts, but we don't become, in his view, sectarian when it comes to these schools of thoughts. So in this way, you can see now why Ibn Taymiyyah is picked up by even some Islamic modernists and reformists, because that idea is actually appealing to them as well, even though they would go in maybe an opposite direction by going towards more liberal ideas, whereas Ibn Taymiyyah might be going towards more conservative ideas. All right. Now, here are some of the ideas that Ibn Taymiyyah came up with that, again, are surprising when we think of Ibn Taymiyyah, at least when first Ibn Taymiyyah comes to mind. He opposed triple divorce, for example. And this idea is picked up by Islamic reformists in the modern period, who are also opposed to triple divorce. And surprisingly, not many Salafis and Wahhabis like to talk about this, but Ibn Taymiyyah may have endorsed universal salvation. That is the idea that all human beings, including non-Muslims, will eventually enter paradise, even though they'll enter hellfire temporarily to be purified of their sins, but eventually they will enter into paradise. Now, whether or not he definitely held this viewpoint, whether he recanted this idea or not, that's open to debate. But his student Ibn al-Qayyim, who is also very a prominent figure in modern Salafi thought, he definitely held on to this viewpoint as well. So again, you can see why Ibn Taymiyyah was an open-minded thinker in some ways. All right, so let's review. We have 3 teams. We have Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. That's player 1, we can think of it as. Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. This is player 3, because player 2 is Ghazali. He represents the Ash'ari theologians, or what comes to be known as Sunni orthodoxy. And then finally, you have team 3, which is represented by Ibn Taymiyyah. He's player number 4, and he is the Sunni uber orthodoxy, or the Hanbalis. I hope this player 1, 2, 3, and 4 makes this easier to understand. If it doesn't, just ignore it. It's kind of playful on my part, but it's just to help understand these ideas. All right. So all 4 of these groups are going to engage in a royal rumble, as I put it. All right, we do have a question about triple divorce. I can answer that before moving on. So we mentioned this in a previous lecture. It seems, at least from a Western scholarly viewpoint, that the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, was the one to actually say that when you declare 3 divorces, that can qualify as an irrevocable divorce. That is 3 separate divorces, and then you can't get back with your ex-wife. This is actually the traditional viewpoint that is held by the madhahib, the 4 madhabs, or most of the people within those 4 madhabs. Ibn Taymiyyah is going to say, no, I don't agree with this. Khalif Umar, he made an ijtihad, it was a well-intentioned ijtihad that was meant to stop people from abusing, saying that they're going to divorce their wives. But clearly this has backfired, and it's against the actual texts. And so when you say you can say 1 million divorces in one setting, that's only going to be one divorce. So this idea of Ibn Taymiyyah's is going to be very attractive to people in the modern period, reformists, who see the abuse of triple divorce in the Indian subcontinent, at least, and many other places as well, in which husbands will declare a triple divorce, and then in order to get back with their wife, they'll force their wife to go through a procedure called halala, in which they have to marry usually a mullah, and that makes the wife halal, and it's a complicated thing. But that's why Ibn Taymiyyah, he's able to see through the four madhabs and go back to the original sources and say, you know what, I'm going to go against this quote unquote consensus that you are claiming. All right, now let's talk about Ghazali. So we're going to start with Ghazali's autobiography. It's called, in English, it's translated as Deliverance from Error. It's less a straightforward autobiography and really his theological and philosophical project loosely mapped onto his life story. And there is some creative license that goes on. I think we can forgive this. It is a profound book. I think you should read it if you get a chance. What's interesting is that he too rejects taqlid, or blind following, quote unquote. This is actually a trope in Islamic history. So we think that it's just a modern thing of rejecting taqlid. It actually extends back hundreds and hundreds of years. I do think in the modern period, what people mean by rejecting taqlid is perhaps more radical than what people in the past meant by it, but it is a recurring trope in Islamic history. Now, Ghazali starts off his biography by talking about a crisis of skepticism that he had. This is, again, quite profound. And it reminds us of René Descartes. So if you've studied René Descartes, he is credited as founding kind of Enlightenment philosophy in the modern West. And Descartes has this, you've probably heard it, I think, therefore I am, right? It's called the cogito. I think, therefore I am. Ghazali has a similar thought experiment that he goes through, where he doubts both empiricism and rationalism. What's empiricism? Empiricism is where we use our senses, our five senses, to understand the world around us. But then Ghazali says, my senses often deceive me. For example, if I see a straw in a glass of water, it looks crooked, even though it's not. Or the sun looks very small to me, even though it's not. So I can't trust my senses 100%. And then as far as rationalism, so there's empiricism and then there's rationalism. Rationalism is what we can deduce by our own mind. He says, well, even my own mind can fool me. So because, I might be living in, I might be dreaming, for example. So when I dream, I think it's reality, but it really is, I wake up and I realize that wasn't reality at all. So he kind of goes into this period of profound skepticism where he thinks that maybe knowledge is unattainable. And then he says that his skepticism was relieved only by, quote, a light which God Most High cast into my breast. That is mystical experience. Now, we might take this in a purely theological sense, in which case its philosophical import is not as useful. But I think what he's primarily saying is that primary truths are unseekable. And this is, in philosophy, is known as foundationalism, that you can't reduce everything down infinitely. Eventually, you just have to rest all of that on what are called primary truths. And I think what Ghazali is saying is quite profound from a philosophical sense. Now then, once Ghazali has reached this point, he then says, he sets off on this quest for truth, and he begins examining the four major groups of his day. Those four major groups are the theologians, that is the Kalam scholars, which are really the Asharis and a little bit the Mu'tazilis as well. The second group are the esotericists. These are known as the Batinis, or the people who are looking for hidden meanings in things. And really, these are the Ismailis. So we see that the Ismaili Shias, we wrongfully sometimes refer to a group of them today as the Agha Khanis. That's not a proper term to use for them. But we see that even though we consider they're a very small group today, in history, the Ismailis are actually They're still a small group, but they have a profound influence on Islamic intellectual thought. So Ghazali also takes aim at them. Then he takes aim at the philosophers, and finally he looks at the Sufis. He has a negative view of the Ismailis and the philosophers. He has a somewhat positive view of the theologians because he himself is a theologian, but he ultimately decides that the real highest truth is available to the Sufis because he prioritizes that mystical experience of God. And so he goes through these four groups, and he claims that he does this in kind of chronological order. Sometimes, Western scholars actually kind of doubt this, and this is why I say, let's give him some creative license here. Now, I'm going to go through a couple more slides, and then we'll take some questions. So one of his influential books is translated in English as The Decisive Criterion, or Faisal at-Tafrika. In this, Ghazali is going to make a criterion by which one can declare a person a Muslim or a non-Muslim, a kafir in his mind, an infidel. Ghazali does this because he is distressed by everyone calling everyone else a kafir or infidel. He says, quote, "For every group accuses those who hold views contrary to its own as being unbelievers." And Ghazali himself is criticized by fellow Asharis that you're not Ashari enough. And we're going to explore this a little bit later. So what he does is he tries to establish a criterion to establish the proper boundary between Islam and kufr, or unbelief. He comes up to this idea, which is that unbelief, or kufr, is to deem anything the Prophet brought to be a lie. That's the criterion. All in a nutshell, that's what it boils down to. Based on this criteria, he argues, this is his view, not mine, that who's in? The Hanbalis, Ahl Hadith, they're in. The theologians, the Asharis, are in. So orthodoxy, uber orthodoxy are both in, and the Sufis are also in. What's interesting here is that he also includes the Mu'tazilis, which are the Islamic rationalists. So that's where we see that he's a little bit, quote unquote, ecumenical from that standpoint. On the other hand, the groups that are out of the bounds of Islam in his viewpoint are the Batinis, quote unquote, the Ismailis, and the Islamic philosophers. And that's why he will write his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, as a critique of them. This book has been translated in English as On the Boundaries of Theological Tolerance in Islam. It's been translated and also has a commentary by Professor Sherman Jackson. The commentary is a glowing commentary of Ghazali's book because Professor Jackson thinks that this is a good criterion to use in the modern period so that people are not declaring fellow Muslims as infidels. So this is Sherman Jackson's view. He argues, based on Ghazali's book, that this modern Muslim tendency to employ the word kafir as this kind of delineator of this moral, ethnic, cultural, or civilizational delineator, he argues that this is a misuse of the category. That is, modern Muslims who are calling each other as kafirs, this is contrary to what happens in the classical period of Islam. This is Professor Jackson's claim. And he argues that based on Ghazali's definition, saying someone is a kafir is not saying that that person is immoral, irreligious, or exempt from recognition in this world. And that's, and so his conclusion, this is his confessional viewpoint here, Professor Jackson argues, as such, it is wholly unnecessary to deny that a person is a kafir simply in order to be able to preserve his or own status as a human being possessed of religion or other laudable qualities. And a key point here, I didn't put this in red, I should have, it's in that second paragraph. He's trying to counter this effort to effectively banish the term kafir from the Muslim lexicon. So what Professor Jackson is trying to do is he's trying to strike a balance between what he sees as the extremists on the right-hand side, the people who are calling all fellow, different Muslim groups kafir, and then what he sees as the other extreme, which is kind of the Islamic modernists or the rationalists, the liberal intellectuals, who want to banish the word kafir from the Islamic dictionary altogether, and that we really shouldn't be calling anyone a kafir. So Sherman Jackson is using Ghazali's text to argue that no, this is the kind of middle way that we should kind of go upon. And again, there's always this idea in Islamic history, we'll see, where everybody tries to show themselves as the middle way between two extremes. Now, I am going to be a little critical of this viewpoint. And in order to do that, I guess I fall in the camp of the liberal intellectual who opposes the use of the word kafir, and I don't support takfir at all. I think it should be banished from our lexicon, from our theology. I think it has no place. And I'll tell you why. You don't have to agree with me, but let's look at takfir. Takfir is calling someone a kafir or an infidel. And it's not just a non-Muslim, Muslim, it is an infidel. And we'll see what I mean by that. The explicit purpose of takfir is to silence debate and shut one's opponent up, using the threat of the sword and even mob violence to do so. It is precisely, I argue, as opposed to what Professor Jackson, and this is my respectful disagreement with him, I say it is precisely to deny the right of life, liberty, and freedom of expression that takfir is pronounced. That it is to declare one's opponent immoral, irreligious, and exempt from receiving in recognition to the very right of life in this world. And here I've quoted Professor Jackson to show that no, I actually think it's the exact opposite. And we can look at Ghazali's own words to prove what I'm trying to say. Ghazali himself in this text says, quote, "Unbelief is a legal designation, its implication being the licitness of shedding the blood of one so designated." That's in the very book that's being translated, by the way. So he's saying that no, it's not just a inconsequential statement. It is that person's blood is licit to shed. It's no longer protected blood. And so the state can, if they wish, shed that blood. And in fact, if a random citizen also sheds that blood, the penalty, there's not necessarily the need for a penalty. You can have a penalty, but it's not necessary. So I find this view to be very problematic, suffice to say. And in his Qanun at-Tawil, which is another book by Ghazali, another text by Ghazali, in a passage clearly alluding to the Islamic philosophers who held that the Prophet used allegories to convey non-literal social utilitarian truths, we're going to talk about this, Ghazali says they, that is the Islamic philosophers, should have their heads cut off. So I take umbrage at the idea that it's not, and Ghazali specifically says that the Islamic philosophers are irreligious. Furthermore, I argue that takfir extends indefinitely. It's not only that people will declare so-and-so a kafir, they'll say whoever believes X is a kafir, and then whoever doubts that such a person is a kafir is himself also a kafir. And this can actually go on ad infinitum. This is a problematic view. And if you read Islamic intellectual history or Islamic history in general, just like Ghazali said, I agree with him. Everyone is accusing everyone else of being a kafir, including even who we think are the Islamic rationalists or the quote unquote liberals of the past. Everyone is doing it to everyone else. So this is quite problematic. Now, I am going to, this is a topic that's near and dear to me. I did spend 6 years in Pakistan. I'm going to be releasing in a deep dive video, a video on the Ahmadis, the issue of the Ahmadis, which are the quote unquote Mirzais or the Qadianis, and the issue of takfir and the laws that have been passed against them in Pakistan. I'm going to be publishing a video on the deep dive. That again, I need to distance. I am not part of the Ghamidi Center, so anything I say in that, that's on my own head, basically. But when I do this, I've been kind of getting some pushback by even people who are well-intentioned within my own family. Please don't address this Ahmadi issue. Please stay away from it. I cannot. I apologize, but I cannot. And one of the issues that, one of the things that people say to me is, look, it's very simple. Whoever agrees with the Shahada is a Muslim, and they don't agree with the Shahada. Okay, I want to just show you where that idea comes from about the Shahada. You often hear this, this text being repeated. Whoever bears witness that there is no God except God and that Muhammad is God's messenger, establishes the prayer and pays the poor due, their lives and properties become inviolable. So that's the basis of this idea that Shahada is all you need to be a Muslim. It sounds like a liberal, well-intentioned, tolerant ideal. Let's look at the full hadith. The full hadith actually, which has the Prophet himself say this, that, quote, I was commanded to fight people until they bear witness that there is no God, etc. That is, until they bear witness, they say the Shahada. And if they do this, their lives and property become inviolable with me. And everyone else, their life and their property is licit to shed. This is the hadith that they're basing this idea on. I also argue that this hadith, I don't think it's historical. I don't think the Prophet said it. This hadith was used, and this is part of the dissertation work that I'm working on jihad and the Quran. And I have a video in which I'll link you, in this PowerPoint too, when I discuss this issue. But this hadith was actually used to completely invert the Quranic logic of war. So there's a verse in the Quran, 839, in which it says, fight them until there is no more fitna, which means religious coercion. And I defend this in the video, in my work, that it means religious coercion. Using this hadith, the medieval exegetes converted this into fight people until they bear witness. That's from the hadith. And fitna was glossed to mean shirk and kufr. So I think the Quranic logic was completely inverted. My point I'm trying to make is that this idea that it's just the shahada, it's simple as that, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it's quite problematic. And I do want to problematize this issue. Furthermore, even this hadith is often used oddly to go against takfir. But really, don't you see the irony here? It's like you're takfir upon takfir. If a man says to his brother, "O kafir," then surely one of them is a kafir. Basically, you're doing takfir again, trying to go against takfir. I believe, it is my view, that the Quran itself disallows anyone on earth, even the Prophet, from doing takfir. No one has that right other than God. And we talked about this in lecture 1 a little bit, but here is a verse that I would refer you to, 3:128, in which it says, and this verse, by the way, is said to be revealed during the Battle of Uhud, in which the Prophet was beaten up, bleeding, a tooth broken. They were trying to kill the Prophet of Islam. And at that time, the Prophet is said to have cursed them, or said, not even cursed them, really just said, what will happen to a people who fight and try to kill their own prophet, along those lines. And then the Quran, this verse was revealed. Not for you, O Muhammad, but for God is the decision whether he should forgive them or punish them. I would contend that none of us are as noble as the prophets, and none of us are as evil as the people trying to kill the prophets. So based on that, I have a problem with takfir. Sorry, I went a little bit off script here. We have some marking on the PowerPoint. Can we see if that can be removed? I think that's from the host side. All right. Now, having said that, I don't want to do injustice to Ghazali. I don't think we can judge Ghazali based on our modern ideas. Tolerance was not exactly an issue. It was not exactly common back then in the theological sense. And Ghazali did, let's be fair, he did sought to widen the boundaries of theological tolerance. So that we need to, I agree with Professor Jackson on that point. My only point is that we should instead today seek simply to tear down this theological border fence. This is why I'm a critic of the Aman message. I think even though it was well-intentioned, it specifically, it just widens the tent, but it still leaves people out of the tent. And I think we should get rid of that tent mentality. Furthermore, as far as Ghazali is concerned, I would say that his criterion, that whoever says that the Prophet lied is a kafir. Come on, does any Muslim say that the Prophet was a liar or lied? No Muslim would say that. If we take a looser definition of what it means for the Prophet to bring a lie, then Ghazali's definition is infinitely malleable. And we'll see that Ibn Taymiyyah can use Ghazali's own definition against Ghazali and the Ash'aris, and the Hanbalis do in fact do that. In fact, there's no real way to contain takfir. Once you allow takfir, it's infinitely malleable. It just spreads infinitely. And we'll see that when I put out that video on Ahmadis, that as soon as they passed the laws against the Ahmadis, the religious right wing, they immediately identified their next target. And they said the Shias are next. And they had theological reasons for doing that, because the same theological reasons, according to their logic that they use against the Ahmadis, they could easily employ that against the Shias. And I'll talk about that in my deep dive video. I also think we should be a little bit critical of Ghazali's motivations. And I think this is really what's motivating Ghazali. Ghazali was criticized by people within his own school of thought, the Ash'aris, for going against Ash'ari theology on some points. I think Ghazali should be celebrated for having that broad-minded independentness. However, I think Ghazali was trying to cover up his own influence, the influence that he had in his own thought from Ibn Sina and the Islamic philosophers. In fact, some Western scholars go to the extent of saying that Ghazali was an Avicennan himself. I think that might be going too far, but it's clear that Ghazali is not too terribly far away from Ibn Sina on many key theological ideas. And in fact, he absorbs much of this thought and brings it into Islamic orthodoxy. And I think that's what Ghazali, part of him might be doing by declaring the Islamic philosophers kafir on 3 points. We're going to see what those 3 points are. That kind of halalizes all the other points. That if only these 3 are kufr, then all the other ideas are okay to bring in. And it's kind of like you see this today, just to give you an example of some people who are critical of hadith, they will then be accused of being munkar hadith or hadith rejectors. So what they'll do then to cover up this is they'll say, no, what those guys are doing is hadith rejecting and they're kafirs, and this is what makes them a kafir, but I'm not one of them. I think that's a cheap tactic. I don't think we should do that. And I am critical of Ghazali for doing this. At least that's what I think he was doing. And I say this even though I'm a big fan of Ghazali and even his work, even his incoherence of the philosophers is quite profound. But I'm just critical of this point of Ghazali. Finally, I would say takfir is used to silence religious dissenters and stifle debate in the Islamic world. It always was and it always is. Reformists are often jailed, killed, or have to flee their countries due to this persecution. Even in the West, this declaration of kufr is used to intimidate and scare Muslims into submission. And I will go into this a little bit in my deep dive video. So this is the worthy tangent. I'm going to talk about takfir and the persecution of Ahmadis. Subscribe to my YouTube for that. Ghazali's contribution to the debate on takfir, it's actually kind of worrisome. And this is Frank Griffel, a scholar of Ghazali, who's writing this. He's pointing out that in early Islam, apostasy could be would only be punished if you had an explicit statement of renouncing Islam. And you could save yourself from it if you just paid public lip service to Islam and said, no, I am Muslim. Now, I don't agree with that either, but this was, again, we're talking about a completely different time. The point is, it was very rare at that time to use legal sanctions, and certainly not the death penalty, especially not against fellow Muslims. It was only in the 5th century AH, or the 11th century AD, that the jurists in the Shafi'ite legal school, that is the same school Ghazali was part of, tried to connect the unbelief of Muslims with what they called clandestine apostasy, or zandaka. Al-Ghazali and his colleagues in Islamic law effectively created a new legal status, that is of clandestine apostasy, that is accusing people of being zindiqs, that is a heretic. So they are creating this new category of heretic and linking it to apostasy, and thereby saying whoever is a heretic is an apostate and therefore should be killed. And Ghazali, his contribution is creating this criterion for apostasy. And we have inherited this criterion to this day. So in traditional Islamic thought, Ghazali's criterion is still the same one that's being used. To be fair to Ghazali, it's not extremist in the sense of calling everybody a heretic or a non-Muslim, but it still has problems, as I discussed. All right, so I think that's a good place to take some questions, and then we might even take a break at this point. So let's see some questions. Khurram, thanks for the question about Zahra Ayubi's gendered morality takedown of Al-Ghazali. I haven't read it, so I apologize. I will look into it and get back to you on that. So let's take some Zoom questions here. All right. The question is, in your opinion, where can you categorize Ghamidi Sahib among the 4 groups? I would say that Ghamidi Sahib, from his own formulation that I see, remember we talked about the 2 groups, the Islamic traditionalists and Islamic rationalists. There's this battle between these two sides. I would say that Ghamidi Saab sees himself as a middle way path between these two. Now, of course, he's not the only one who has ever claimed that, but I do think in certain ways his contribution is unique and that he is trying to tread a middle path. So I don't think he would fall into either of any of these four groups. But I think in order to understand Ghamidi Saab's thought, you do need to understand the historical tradition of Islam. That's as far as I can tell, but you should, of course, ask Ghamidi Saab directly. And then someone else asked, what about the Maturidis? They are fairly similar to the Asharis. In fact, they're often used synonymously. Now, when they first started, there was a difference. Maturidis were a halfway point. Again, everybody's trying to do this halfway point, but they were a halfway point between the Asharis and the Mu'tazilis. But eventually, they became subsumed under the Asharis and are almost used synonymously in a lot of ways. All right. Let's take some video questions. Please raise your hand if you have any video questions. I encourage those, even if you've already texted your question. If I haven't gotten to it, please do raise your hand and I'll call on you. We do have one Facebook Live question that I'll answer. What was the view of Ghazali on Kashf and antinomianism? As mentioned by Dr. Hashmi, and you can just call me Javad, that's fine. He was an Ashari who follows scripture and rationalism, but obviously prefers scripture more. It would be interesting to know still his view on antinomianism, which is rejecting laws and scripture. So Ghazali had a positive view towards Kashf, that is unveiling, mystical unveiling, but he had a negative view towards antinomianism. Ghazali was a sober Sufi. Remember we talked about the sober and drunk distinction of Sufism? He was definitely a sober type. And he actually criticized, one of his criticisms, as we'll see probably in next week's lecture against the philosophers, is he thought that the philosophers were somewhat antinomian. We'll clarify that next time, but he was definitely strict about following the letter of the law. Mr. Hassan Osmani, please go ahead. If you can unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if there are some major topic areas which one can illustrate the four different viewpoints. I know you've talked about abstract ideas like, can God be, reached through discussion, or, or can one make laws or rules that are not directly derived? Or you've talked about apostasy, but are there actually kind of major day-to-day issues on which they, one can illustrate the different approaches that the four schools have?
Excellent.
Not four schools, four categories.
Yeah, four groups, four major groups. Yes. So that's, I'm really, and I know I always promise this, but it's really lecture 2 in which I will give very concrete examples, but I'll signal to it right now. The major thing it will have an effect on that's very relevant to our contemporary discourse is on when it comes to reconciling religion and science, revelation and scripture. So to give a very concrete example, the Islamic philosophers, they understood that the creationist story in the Quran did not comport with the scientific theories of their day. Remember, they had that emanationist theory of the universe. That's why that was important. I know it seemed esoteric, but that's why that topic was important, why I spent so much time on it in the last lecture. So they understood that the Quranic account differs from the scientific account of their day. So they basically said that scripture is largely to be taken as allegorical in nature. So they're going to interpret it as allegory. Meanwhile, the Kalam scholars, represented by the Asharis, they're going to be, and by the way, of these four groups, the Mu'tazilis are pretty much eliminated, like they've died off pretty much by this time. So it's really just these three groups, the Hanbalis, Asharis, and the philosophers. So the philosophers will use metaphor more than allegory. And we saw that when it came to God's attributes. And then finally, the Hanbalis will be more literalist and say we have to take at least the apparent meaning of the text. And we're gonna get into this in quite some depth in this lecture, but even more so in lecture number 2, in which we're just gonna focus on practical application, I promise you. All right. Anyone else who has a verbal question, please raise your hand.
So Sadia here.
Please go ahead.
It may be a perception and it may be erroneous. Sorry, my daughter's right here, so she's making a noise. But it seems like whatever side you turn to, both in the subcontinent as well as in North America, all the Muslim scholars seem to be heavily influenced by Ghazali. Is that just a perception? And if it isn't, then why? So, weren't there other people who were equally, influential and equally bright?
Yeah, thank you. Ghazali is definitely, I would say, the most influential theologian of Islamic history. One of the reasons we have to give credit to him, he was incredibly profound and prolific in his works. I don't think you could be on any side of the intellectual debate. I think if you do read all of Ghazali and you say it's all garbage, I think there's a problem with the way you're approaching. I'm not saying you, but I'm just saying anyone. So Ghazali is very profound, and he has these ideas that are very applicable to the contemporary period. The second thing is, I would push back on the idea that he is used by all Islamic groups today. So the Salafi or the Wahhabi movement would not use Ghazali so much, really at all. Maybe some of the more open-minded ones would occasionally quote him, but really they would push back against that because they would follow Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a critic of Ghazali. Now, what has happened historically is that the more rationalist figures have died off. So Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, you asked the question, was there anyone more influential? Well, Ibn Sina was the most influential Islamic philosopher, hands down, no questions asked. Yet I didn't even know who Ibn Sina was until I started my academic studies. I had never heard of him growing up. I did vaguely. I thought he was just some sort of scientist. I didn't know that he wasn't actually an Islamic thinker. So I think that orthodoxy has done a good job. And there are two groups of claiming orthodoxy: the Salafi, the Wahhabis, and the Asharis, represented by Al-Azhar University, and the Maturidis, which is kind of what the Deobandis, like that's kind of Islamic ulama class in India, Pakistan. All of these groups have done a good job of basically citing their own scholars and limiting the use of anyone else. So if you quoted like Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd, you would be kind of like, who is that? That's kind of a marginal figure in Islamic history. So they have intentionally marginalized those figures, even though in history they were actually quite influential to such a point that Ghazali felt obligated to respond to them. That's how I would answer. But again, in the modern period, it is changing, and now many intellectuals are trying to bring back these thinkers. And that's part of what I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to widen our viewpoints. I still take from Ghazali. I love Ghazali, but I think Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina have some great ideas as well. Even Ibn Taymiyyah does for me. So that's how I approach it. All right, we're gonna take one more question and then we'll go for a quick break. Let's see here. All right. I don't know if I have any more here. All right, so any more verbal questions? If not, we'll go for a break right now. Okay, let's go for a quick 7-minute break. Thank you very much. We'll meet back at 15, so that's 7:15 Central. Thank you. All right, and we are back. I apologize for the delay. It was prayer time here in Boston, and we got another scribble or scrabble on the donate right there. So if we could get rid of that, that would be great. Let's get started again. Let's cover some more material before we get back into questions. All right, so Ghazali creates the criterion for defining who is a Muslim and who is not. And then he specifically criticizes the Islamic philosophers for being infidels or crypto-infidels based on 3 beliefs that they held. Now, his book, this is in his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a very famous book. You have to know this book if you're going to study Islamic intellectual history. And again, some of these topics, I appreciate the question about relevance. Trust me, it is relevant. You do have to understand it within its historical context in order to meaningfully apply it to the contemporary period. Once you get it all, though, I think you're going to see that this will really start to click. So Ghazali writes this book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. It's 20 chapters long, but and each chapter deals with a specific topic of the Islamic philosophers, which Ghazali has a problem with. But it's 3 of these which he believes are completely unacceptable and qualify as infidelity. These are those 3 beliefs. The first is the Islamic philosophers believed that the universe was eternal, not just eternal, but pre-eternal. That is, it didn't begin at a specific moment in time. So that's the first belief that he opposed. The second, I just got to adjust my, give me 1 second here. Okay. The second is the idea that God, apologize one more time. I gotta fix this. Okay. So the second is that God knows only universals, not particulars. That might not make much sense to you right now. We're going to talk about it. And then finally, the idea that resurrection will be spiritual, not bodily. We're going to talk about those in reverse order. I meant to create the last one in red there. Oh, I know why, because I have to go back. All right, so here's I didn't get to as far as I wanted to initially. So here's Ghazali's book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. We talked about how there were 20 ideas held by the Islamic philosophers corresponding to 20 chapters of his book. 17 of these in his mind constitute blameworthy error, but only 3 of these ideas constitute manifest infidelity or kufr. But it's important to point out that more than just these particular beliefs is a difference in worldview, specifically in the conception of God between the Islamic philosophers and the Islamic theologians. In the philosopher's viewpoint, you can think of God as almost a entity or a principle, whereas for the Islamic theologians, God is a personal being. He is a person. Not in a human person, but in the sense that he has a personality, he is a person in that sense. And this is the difference that scholars, Western scholars now, talk about between the God of classical theism, that's what philosophers held on to, and then the God of kind of the Abrahamic conception of God, of traditional Abrahamic conception, which is of theistic personalism. So this difference between the God of the philosophers of classical theism versus the God of this personalistic God. The difference is that one of them, the God of the philosophers, is basically the source of the universe, of the entire universe. He's the cause of the entire universe. But when you read some of the texts of the Islamic philosophers, you could almost read it as it is the cause of the Islamic universe, as opposed to in traditional Islamic conception use the word he. Now, it's important for the Islamic philosophers to affirm, the Islamic theologians to affirm God's personality, that he is, Hanbalis will even go to the extent of saying that God is happy and sad and this kind of thing. The Islamic theologians, the Kalam scholars won't go to that extent, but they do want to affirm that God has a will, that he is a willing agent, an active agent in the world. Whereas for the Islamic philosophers, they have a more kind of scientific view, you can say, where God is almost part of their science. You'll often see in debates today, and again, here I'm trying to make it relevant to the modern context. You'll see debates today between believers, Muslims and Christians versus atheists. And atheists will often say, look, I'll grant you your philosophical, well, sometimes they'll say, okay, your proof gets you to some conception of a creator of the universe, but it doesn't get you to this personal God of theism that you hold on to. An Islamic philosopher would say, yeah, pretty much. The personalistic God is an allegorical representation of what God actually is, which is the first one, or the principle upon which everything else is built. So this idea of kind of Spinoza's God you may have heard of is not terribly far off from, it's a straight line from what the Islamic philosophers were saying and kind of Spinoza's conception. They're not identical, but there is this line that goes to them. So these are the 3 beliefs that that Ghazali took aim at as being unacceptable, and we went through this. One is the pre-eternality of the universe, that God only knows universals, not particulars, and that resurrection will be spiritual, not bodily. So we're going to be addressing these in reverse order, and now I hope this will become slightly relevant to you at least. Let's look at what resurrection will be. Before we do that, let's recap. Remember that in a previous lecture, we talked about how the Quran describes God as having a face, eyes, hands. He sits on a throne. And the Hadith even use more such language, such as the idea that God, quote unquote, descends to the lowest heaven every night to listen to supplicants. And God has a spatial location up. That is, when somebody was asked what their faith was, the slave girl was asked, for example, in this one Hadith, and then who do you believe in? The Prophet supposedly asked, and then the slave girl points up to God, meaning in that view, if you take that literally, God is literally located upward. God, they also speak of God having fingers and feet, etc. Now, as we talked about this in a previous lecture, so I'm breezing through this, but we saw how the Hanbalis affirm that God has a face, 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 shins, and 2 feet. He sits on his throne and resides above the heaven. One could, if one was a critic, say that they believe in a sky god, and they believe that he descends to the lowest heaven every night. Now, of course, they would add on the bila kaif doctrine, which is without howness. So they would say, yes, God has a face, but it's not a face like you and I have. It's this other sort of face that we don't have details about. So it would be unfair to say that they're exactly saying that God has a face and eyes like you and I do. But a critic, and I would count myself as such a critic, would say, hey, when you put it all together, it does sound very anthropomorphic. Now, the Kalam scholars, the Mutakallimun, the Ash'aris, and even the Mu'tazilis, they understood these metaphorically. That is, we saw that in a previous lecture. So God's eyes just means God's omniscience, or his ability to see everything that goes on this earth. It doesn't mean that he literally has eyes, or it could mean his providential, his divine providence. So they understood these things metaphorically. The Islamic philosophers, however, they go even further, and they understand many of these statements as allegorically. So we see that the Kalam scholars tend to go for metaphor. The Islamic philosophers go toward allegory. Their view was that religion, by its very nature, employs the language of symbolism, metaphor, and allegory. So for the Kalam scholars, all of this would be kind of an exception to the rule, whereas for the Islamic philosophers, they say religion, the literature, the scripture is suffused with symbolism, metaphor, and allegory. In fact, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, will criticize the Islamic theologians for taking God's attributes all metaphorically. He will argue that if God wanted to use this metaphorical, if he didn't want to get this kind of impression in someone's mind of this kind of quote unquote sky god, or God as this kind of father figure in heaven, God would not have used that such language, but that this is allegorical language that is used to convey exactly that point to the common man, even though we as the Islamic philosophers we understand it as allegory. There's a specific purpose for using such anthropomorphic language. We're going to get into this in a little bit more detail later. So this was the allegorization that the philosophers engaged in. They believed that the commoners, the awam, that is kind of the rabble, the masses, they cannot understand and appreciate the subtle belief in God as the one who or that controls the universe through a series of causal intermediaries. So religion, what it does is it packages this belief in symbolic language. God as a king, the king of kings. What they're saying is, look, the Quran describes God as a king, but God is not really a king. King is somebody who wears a crown, has a, is the caliph. That's not what God is. But by getting that idea, that allegorical idea in your mind, the average person adopts the proper attitude towards the one. For example, during prayer, we observe the rules of conduct usually observed in the presence of kings: humility, quietness, lowering the eyes, etc. So the point is that it's an allegory, and not meant to be taken literally. And the reason why God uses this is because if God just referred to himself, the Quran just referred to it as the one, that would be too abstract to apply to most people's daily lives. And they would not be able to connect to such an abstract idea. And this, by the way, is a point that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qudama was a compatriot of Ibn Taymiyyah. He was of the same Hanbali school of thought. He argued, could not God, Ibn Qudama asks ironically, say istawla, overpower, if he really wanted to say this word? This relates to the word for, remember we talked about God establishing himself on the throne. Well, the Mutakallimun, they used metaphor, and they said that no, what it really means is God overpowers the throne, or he encompasses the throne with his, the universe with his might. And And Ibn Qudama is saying, why didn't he just say that? So according to the Islamic philosophers, they actually have an answer to that. They say the Quran purposely uses such anthropomorphic language in order to impart relevance and convey reverence of God. So Ibn Rushd, on the nature of God, he writes, we would say that the general public must be given the religious answer, that is the religious understanding, and be told that God is light, for it is the attribute that God described himself within the precious book. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Since light is the noblest of all existing things, it is necessary to present to them, that is the general public, the noblest of all beings by it. This sort of description is appropriate to both classes of people, the intellectual elite, which Ibn Rushd is part of, and the masses, the awam, the hoi polloi, and rightly so. So according to Ibn Rushd, he was one of the Islamic philosophers, the Quran and scripture in general uses symbols and allegories, which the masses tend to take literally, and that's okay because it gets them to the right destination, which is a proper orientation with them and God. But it also gives a hint to the intellectual elite, that is the philosophers, the people who have great wisdom, that it gives them hints to the actual truth beneath that. So the Quran provides a basis for both the average person and the elite. So we saw in a previous lecture how the beatific vision, I hope I pronounced that right, but that is when we are said to see God on the day of judgment, as well as the scale, which is when our deeds are supposed to be weighed on the scale on the day of resurrection. The bridge that we're supposed to cross that is described as like a hair thin, like a sword, very thin, and on one side is hell, etc. And then the pond. These are all descriptions that the Hanbalis and Ash'aris tend to take literally, although Ghazali takes the scale to be metaphorical, and we'll see why he does, by the way, that's important. The Mu'tazilis, on the other hand, understand these to be metaphorical. The Islamic philosophers, on the other hand, really understand these as allegories. Let's look at Ibn Taymiyyah, what Ibn Taymiyyah says about seeing God. He says, yes, the Quran says no vision can grasp him, but what this means is that no vision can encompass God. That does not mean, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, that he cannot be seen, because denying that he may be seen is describing him in terms that may be applied to something non-existent. This is a recurring idea of Ibn Taymiyyah. He's basically saying, look, if you take everything as metaphor and everything as allegory, his criticism is against the theologians and the philosophers, then basically you're believing in a God that can't see, can't hear, because he doesn't have eyes, he doesn't have ears, he's even can't, some people didn't even want to describe God as an existent. So he doesn't exist, he can't be seen. What do you call all of that? He doesn't have a place, he doesn't have anything. That's pretty much a non-existent entity. And so that's Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism of the theologians and the philosophers. Now, so we've talked about metaphor and allegory when it comes to these things that we talked about in the previous lecture. Now let's talk about the Quranic description of paradise. The Quran describes paradise as composed of gardens under which rivers flow, rivers made of honey, wine, milk, and fresh water, with palm trees and grapevines, fruits and springs, and it's a moderate climate. What do you notice about all of these things? You also have bracelets of gold that the believers will be have, garments of fine silk. They'll be reclining on couches, cushions. And then also there's talk of wine and women, pure spouses or huris. You could just put it in the, actually, does somebody want to raise their hand and what do you think about these descriptions? Like, what do you see that's common about these descriptions? Who do you think they would appeal to? Does anybody have any comment on this? Nobody? Come on, someone take a stab at this. Okay, so Khurram said, can you elaborate? Can you, Khurram, can you elaborate on the audio, please?
Sorry. Hello, Assalamu alaikum. I guess, and I'm being a little short with my words, but it's, you know, the idea of people who didn't have, you know, a lot of physical or material wealth and belongings. You know, the Prophet ﷺ himself, he, you know, slept on essentially a thin layer of animal skin between himself and the hard floor, that, you know, lived sort of ascetic lives. So these sorts of things, you know, cold, fresh water and fresh fruits, I think was just just kind of civilizationally almost appealing. Like this was like what I, from my understanding, my reading is that this was what sort of was amazing when they got to Damascus, that these things were actually.
Okay, great. Thank you, Khurram. And actually, you just engaged in a process that we'll see that Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina will be forced into. So you wrote in the comments, you wrote for desert people, and then you kind of adjusted your language when you spoke in audio. Why? Because you felt that that could be disrespectful, and I appreciate that you did that. But that was the answer that I was looking for, actually, that it does appeal to desert people, right? That the Quran is addressed to people coming from the desert. So you see that process by which the Islamic philosophers are going to be able to kind of accept that idea, but that will, somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah could see that as offensive. And so we'll see that dynamic as we go forward. So I'm actually really glad that we had that interaction. Okay, so now, so that's the Quranic description of paradise. What is now Ghazali? He is charitable in this sense that he does mostly accurately represent the Islamic philosophers. So actually, I'm citing Ghazali to show you what the Islamic philosophers say about these descriptions. So what the Islamic philosophers say is that what has come down to us in the revealed law, that is the revealed text, are parables struck to meet the level of the understanding of created humanity, in the same sense that the anthropomorphic verses and reports of the Prophet or the Quran that have come down to us are analogies proportionate to the understanding of created humanity. Ghazali will respond, we answer, to make these two things equal is arbitrary. What two things is he talking about? He's talking about, because remember, Ghazali himself will resort to metaphor and analogy when it comes to God's attributes. So Ibn Rushd and the philosophers are going to say, look, we're doing the same thing, we're just doing it with a different topic. But Ghazali is going, and Ibn Taymiyyah is going to attack both of these guys on this point. But Ghazali will say, no, there is a difference between God's attributes and the descriptions of paradise. The reason is, really the reason that he says is that the bodily descriptions, the corporeal like rewards and punishments are possible, and therefore we can't deny them. Whereas the descriptions of God's attributes are impossible, and therefore we have to deny them. And why are they impossible? They're impossible based on the rational proofs that Ghazali and the Ash'ari theologians accept. And so we'll see that we need some sort of canon or some sort of rule to say what can we allegorize and what can we not allegorize. And so we'll see that eventually Ghazali will actually answer this question. So why do the Islamic philosophers have to deny these descriptions, these materialistic descriptions of paradise? It's because according to the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic science of the day, it is only the soul, that a part of the soul actually, that survives the body's death. And so that actually this idea of the bodily resurrection opposed their scientific view of the day. We don't normally consider life after death to be scientific, but back then they didn't have this differentiation. So it was part of their scientific worldview. Ghazali is actually going to say, no, this is not a part of science. This is part of metaphysics, and should therefore, we should just take what the religious texts say and not mix science and our religion on this aspect. So you'll see actually Ghazali's view is it is profound here. And then so we can say that at least some of, or most of the philosophers embrace the concept of a purely spiritual resurrection. And obviously they were also a little bit discomforted with kind of the sensual descriptions of some of the rewards in paradise, which I think many of people who are more liberal-minded today would also be uncomfortable with. And then they were also bothered by the kind of gruesome punishments that are described in the hellfire. They said that these were actually allegorical descriptions to describe what happens to souls who did not reach this highest level. They actually, some of the philosophers said, and this was according to their science of the day, that those kind of souls just go into extinction. They're just non-existent. And this, or they would say, if they didn't go to that extent, they would say that whoever fails to achieve this union with God, which is the ultimate spiritual reward that you get in paradise, they would be so blaming their self for not reaching that state. They would be in a state of misery that is analogous, that is can only be described to people by these corporeal punishments that are mentioned in the Quran. And so this is how they kind of allegorized these interpretation, this idea. Now, Ghazali argued that this is contrary to the belief of Muslims in their entirety. Of course, he's using this idea of ijma. Ibn Rushd would respond, of course, there's no ijma on this because we philosophers that you're debating with don't agree with it. So how is there this consensus? Now, over here, I'm just going to breeze through this really quickly. It is debatable about whether or not Ibn Sina actually believed in a purely spiritual resurrection. Remember, Ghazali's book is written against Ibn Sina in particular, but Ibn Sina in some texts does actually acknowledge that there is a bodily resurrection, at least for some people. And he even says here that the true religion brought into the world by our Prophet Muhammad has described in detail the state of happiness or misery awaiting us in the hereafter so far as the body is concerned. So he's actually making this distinction that, look, with our science or philosophy of the day, we know that the soul will go on and get these rewards. Our science doesn't tell us much about this bodily resurrection. We leave that to religion to tell us what happens to that. Now, whether or not he actually had this view or not is a debate, because as we'll see, the Islamic philosophers, just like Khurram, sorry to pick on you here, but just how he kind of took back his, the words about the desert people, Ibn Sina and the Islamic philosophers also will kind of, they're going to hedge what they say and kind of have double meaning to a lot of what they say, because they know that the fundamentalists, the Hanbalis, and are going to basically recruit the hoi polloi, the masses, the common people, with pitchforks against them. So they have to be kind of dodgy in the words that they use. And because of this, it's not very clear, did Ibn Sina really believe in a purely spiritual heaven or not? Ibn Rushd now, he definitely did believe in a purely spiritual paradise. But he argued that, again, towards the same view that religion uses parables and symbols to convey these spiritual realities to men. And then on this third point, and I'm breezing through a lot of this, I apologize, but I do have to pick up speed a little bit. So he does point out that Ghazali himself, in one point he says in this book, The Incoherence, that no Muslim believes in a purely spiritual resurrection. But in another book of his, he says that the Sufis hold on to it. So he's pointing out this inconsistency. And I think Ibn Rushd is correct in pointing out this inconsistency. And then he points out, and it should be pointed out further, that Ghazali himself argues that it is impossible to explain the spiritual world, the unseen, without using allegories. Heck, even Ibn Taymiyyah we talked about how Ibn Taymiyyah believes that hellfire will come to an end. Even Ibn Taymiyyah takes these words not at literal face value. So Ibn Rushd concludes that it is only a speculative problem. That is, it is an area of fair debate between people and between theologians and philosophers, and therefore we shouldn't, rush to judgment and call somebody a kafir or not. And here is Ghazali's own allegorization. Here's a hadith how death will be brought forth on the day of judgment in the form of a black and white ram and slaughtered between paradise and hell. Ghazali has to allegorize this because according to the science that he holds on to, which is atomism, is different than the science the philosophers hold on to, which is more Neoplatonic. But Ghazali basically says that death is an accident. Now you might not know what an accident is. It's part of the Greek atomism. But basically he's forced to, on the science that he acknowledges, allegorize this hadith. So again, we're going to see that we need a rule. What do we allegorize and what do we not allegorize? Now here comes Ibn Taymiyyah with his flying elbow. He's going to take out both groups. He's going to say those who follow in the footsteps of the philosophers say that only the soul will be resurrected. And then he's going to say that they argue this just like the Ash'aris argue about the attributes of God. They allegorize or use metaphor when it comes to God's attributes. That allows them to do this when it comes to the resurrection. That's why we shouldn't do this in general. And what both of these groups in his mind are saying is that the prophets lied to serve some interest. What does he mean by this? The Islamic philosophers did have the idea that God and his prophet use allegories in order to promote social utility. This is actually a very Durkheimian view. If you know who Emil Durkheim is, he's a sociologist of religion in the modern period. He argues that religions use these allegories and symbols in order to convey, promote social utility. It's something that people bond over and etc. You can look into it, but basically that's a view that's not that foreign from what the Islamic philosophers are saying here. Now, the only difference is that the philosophers would not say that the Prophet lied. They would say that using an allegory is not lying. Now, Ghazali is going to claim that that's saying that the Prophet lied. And so Ibn Taymiyyah is going to double on that and say, yes, that is lying, but you, Ghazali, are also guilty of that. My assessment. I would say that the modality of the hereafter is unknown, and the Quran seems to be using symbolic and allegorical language to describe it, something Ghazali well recognizes. However, one could certainly insist that the Quran indicates a bodily resurrection, and I think a plain sense reading of the Quran would certainly indicate this. Even so, the Islamic philosophers are not denying the existence of the hereafter and are only questioning its modality, just as Ghazali does not question God's attributes, but only their modality. Furthermore, even according to the classical understanding, infidelity should only be imputed to clear-cut cases of apostasy. Ibn Sina's statements are vague and contradictory, and at most require clarification. Now, you could say that Ibn Sina was purposefully being vague and contradictory. Well, I would say that that still saves him from any judgment of apostasy, even by the classical rules of the law. In my view, then, Ghazali's imputation of infidelity on this point seems unwarranted, even if you would take the plain reading of the text and agree with him on the point. So here, my score so far, 1-0, philosophers 1, Ghazali 0, as far as his 3 points. That's where I meant to take the break, so let's speed up a little bit. So the second view is that God knows only universals, not particulars. I'm not going to go into this, but basically this is based on, I'm only going to rush through it because we're running out of time, and it might be too esoteric. But the point is that even here, the viewpoint of the Islamic philosophers is more ambiguous and vague when it comes to it, and it's not quite clear whether they're actually denying that God does not know particulars or not. And Ibn Rushd definitely takes a different viewpoint. I have these in the slides if you want to look into them, and we can discuss this further if you want. The point, though, is, and this is why I'm going to bring up Ibn Taymiyyah, what the Islamic philosophers are saying is that by that God not knowing particulars, is they didn't want God, they needed God to be not only pre-eternal and eternal, but unchanging. That was important. Why does God have to be unchanging in their philosophical viewpoint? The reason is that we only change because of certain fallibility on our part. So, for example, let's say, and this is why the universe has to be eternal as well. So, for example, let's not use samosas, since I've used samosas a lot. Let's use chicken shashlik. My wife recently made chicken shashlik during Ramadan and COVID. Now, I never got chicken shashlik before from her. Why? Because many things had to happen for me to get chicken shashlik. Number one is COVID had to happen. She was staying at home instead of working, so she had time to become a cooking master, which she now is. Ramadan had to be happening. We had to get the materials to make the chicken shashlik. We had to go to the store and get those materials. And then we had to bring them, and then she had to look up the ingredients for them. Only until all of those things coalesced was my wife able to cook the chicken shashlik. But for God, God doesn't need anything. So he should, why would he need to wait to create the universe? He would just create it. It would just be an effect. He would be the cause and the universe would be the effect. Nothing could change that would cause God to do anything. Similarly, nothing could change in this world to change God's knowledge. So for example, God's knowledge of whether or not my wife cooked chicken shashlik could not just change. If we say that his knowledge changed once she did that act, that would imply that God's knowledge prior to that act was deficient. And so it was important to say that God's knowledge does not change. So this was the debate about God knowing universals or particulars. I didn't go into detail, but that's the basic idea. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah is going to come along and then kind of smack down both groups. He's going to say that basically what both of you guys are saying, because even the the Islamic theologians would describe God as hearing and seeing, but they wouldn't say that God has ears and eyes, which he could see or hear. So what Ibn Taymiyyah is going to say is, if God were not living, knowing, hearing, seeing, and speaking, it would necessarily follow that he is dead, ignorant, deaf, blind, and mute. He must be exonerated of these imperfections. Indeed, he has created whoever is living, hearing, seeing, speaking, etc., and he is more worthy to be said to have those things, those qualities. Indeed, every perfection in a cause-created thing is from the perfection of the Creator. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah is actually saying something profound here. This is the viewpoint of many theists today who take the personal theistic view of God. They say that every perfection that humans have, God has it to an even more perfection. He actually has it at the real perfected stage, and we only have a deficient level of that thing. Whereas the classical theists are going to say, no, we have to describe God completely differently. And so what the Islamic philosophers say is, yes, God knows everything that occurs in the universe, but we can't say it's due to his hearing or sight. There can't be some deficiency in him. He knows it because he is the cause, and because he is the cause and he knows himself, he knows every effect that occurs in a downstream way. So God is the cause of the universe. Everything else is a downstream effect. And so God knows everything because he is the cause, not because of the effect. Does that make any sense? That according to Ibn Taymiyyah, God would know us because he sees the effect. But according to the Islamic philosophers, God knows everything because he is the cause of the effects. This is quite fine, but it's an important distinction to make. To me, my assessment, Ghazali does not seem that terribly far off from Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd on this topic. To me, this seems to be simply a complicated and arcane theological debate. So why throw accusations of infidelity around? Ibn Sina's statements can be read in both ways, and it seems to me that Ghazali himself acknowledged the more charitable reading that, in fact, Ibn Sina does believe that God knows everything that exists in the universe. So why then the generalization of his pronouncement of takfir? Or perhaps we should not understand it as a general pronouncement of takfir. In that case, Ghazali should have been clearer on this matter. So 2-0 for Ghazali, against Ghazali. Finally, we have the pre-eternity of the universe. This is really the crux of the matter. This is where Ghazali will really take aim. Why is it important to Ghazali? It's important to Ghazali because according to the Islamic theologians, you need to believe that the universe was created at a certain point in time, quote unquote, because otherwise there's no reason to posit the existence of God. That's why they want to say that no, the universe can't be eternal. And in fact, in Western philosophy and Western science, it used to be thought that the universe is eternal, and therefore there's no reason to posit the existence of God. You don't need to posit the existence of a creator since the thing already exists. So he says, Ghazali basically points out, look, this is what the atheistic materialists say. And what the atheistic materialists say makes it at least is more consistent, even if it is false. Now, Ibn Sina and the Islamic philosophers, they still do believe that God is the cause of all things, but it is more of a cause and effect relationship, and that the cause and the effect coexist simultaneously. Think of the sun and the rays, right? They exist simultaneously. The metaphor for sun being God is very applicable to the Islamic philosophers, or the movement of the hand in relation to the ring, or even a man or a woman and their shadow. When you move, your shadow also moves with it. God in that sense is you, and the shadow is the universe. And that's really an apt comparison because according to this philosophy, our world is kind of just a shadow existence. And God is really the ultimate existent in the, it is really existence. Everything else is just a facsimile of existence. Or think of a flashlight and its light beam. Once you turn it on, the flashlight and the flash beam, they exist simultaneously. The question arises, what was God doing before he created the universe? Does that mean that there was a time before time? That doesn't make any sense because according to the theologians, the Ash'ari theologians, God created time and space at the same moment. Well, then what are you even arguing about? The Islamic philosophers say there was no time before that. And also, you're basically saying that some outside factor must cause the flashlight to turn on. But what could act as a cause upon God? God is the creator, and so must therefore always be creating. This is a necessary part of his perfection. Michael Chase, a professor, this is a contemporary professor, he argues, he points out that there is no explicitly formulated doctrine of creation ex nihilo in the Quran, any more than in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. Creation ex nihilo is the view that most of us take, that God created the universe. So often we take the view that, right, the Big Bang, we believe in the Big Bang maybe, but God created the Big Bang. But Michael Chase is pointing out that there is no explicit text in the Quran that talks about creation ex nihilo. Instead, God's creation of the world is generally depicted as taking place out of a primordial water, while the heavens were created out of smoke. Elsewhere, earth and heaven are conceived as a solid mass, which God separates. That is, God is more the demiurge that creates the universe out of pre-existent matter, so to speak. So Ibn Rushd points out a purely literal reading of the Quran does not support creation ex nihilo. And he cites this verse of the Quran, for example, where God says, "Then he turned to heaven while it was smoke and said unto the earth, come willingly or unwillingly." He says that, look, even the theologians don't take this in the apparent meaning, and they use this as allegory or metaphor. We're doing the same thing. He points out that what religion has intended with respect to the knowledge of the world, that is the creation of the universe, is simply that it is made by God Almighty and invented by him, and that it did not come to be by chance or by itself. Now, this should answer the question of what relevance all of this is. They're basically taking the creation and the cosmology in the Quran as allegory, and that the point of it is that God is the source, ultimate source of it, but not that we should take it literally. Here comes Ibn Taymiyyah. He's going to attack both. The Islamic philosophers say that they are refuting the argument of those who believe that God was idle and then began to be active after being inactive. Remember, the Islamic philosophers were of the view that God is the creator, and so he must always be creating. He argues that the creator, yes, the creator has always been creating from eternity, but it does not mean that the universe itself is eternal. That is to say, our universe is just one existent, but before there could have been other universes that God was creating. So Ibn Taymiyyah is actually putting forth a view that could lead us down the multiverse theory. Ibn Rushd is going to negate and he explicitly does, by the way, Ibn Rushd negates the multiverse theory. And we'll see Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi, actually, who is an Avicenna's philosopher, will affirm the multiverse theory. The point is that these people were discussing very profound topics that are very relevant to today's discussion. Overall, I agree with Ibn Tufail's assessment, and he was, again, an ally of Ibn Rushd, that the implications are the same. On both views, God is the cause of all things, and all are his effects, whether they came out of nothing or had no beginning in time. As Ibn Rushd says, the doctrines about the world are not all so far apart from one another that some of them should be charged as unbelief and others not. The desire to assert the universe's temporality, that is, that it was created at a certain moment in time, is rooted in the need to affirm the universe's createdness, as everything other than God must be created. Is not the belief in a pre-eternal and uncreated Quran even more problematic and this is me speaking, by the way, even more problematic than a pre-eternal and created universe? Although creation ex nihilo seems to make more intuitive sense to me, and that's generally, I'm agnostic, to be honest, as far as this viewpoint is concerned. But it seems ex nihilo, our Ghazali's viewpoint, seems at least more intuitive to me. I think ultimately we cannot know, and maybe we should not put all our eggs in one basket. Yes, we're all very happy that the science of our day points towards the temporality of the universe, that the universe had a beginning. It might turn out in 100 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, that the theory of the multiverse really gets more credibility to it. And then I think it's, are we going to have all our belief collapse because we put all our eggs in one basket? I think the real debate, by the way, between Ghazali and the philosophers is about whether or not God is an actively willing agent or not. That is the true debate that these two groups were having. So overall, so far in this lecture, I've given all 3 points against Ghazali. However, in the next lecture, when we meet next week, I'm going to give some points to Ghazali, and we'll see that it will be neck and neck. Let's see. Do we have time to go on? I think we're going to have to call it a day here. All right. So I did want to go. Let's see. Let me ask the Ghamidi Center. We had some time for prayers. Can we go 15, 20 more minutes, or should we call it a day here?
You should call it a day and continue next time.
Okay.
On this same. You don't
let's
have to. Yeah.
Let's do that. Finally, I just wanted to close. Did we have the chaplain here? We did not. So finally, I just wanted to say a couple words about what's going on. You know, I think there are a lot of South Asians in our class. We know that there is a lot of racism against Black people, even within especially within our communities. So I think this is something that we should really reflect upon. If anyone else has any words to say, please go ahead. Any last questions? We can go for another 10 minutes and call it a day then, as far as questions and answers are concerned.
Jawad, I'd love to comment on that issue once you're done with your question and answers.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Any questions, or should we just go to that final comments? Okay, go ahead, please. Sarah Baji, go ahead.
First of all, I just want to say it was a really nice distraction to have class today. It was a blessing to have this break from the weight of this last week. I think we've all been feeling a lot of things in the last 2 weeks. You might be feeling anger, sadness, fear, frustration, rage, distress. I think I felt all of those simultaneously and at different times. And alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to be feeling these things, right? It tells us that our senses are still functioning, the senses that Allah gifted us with, through which we can know God better. But what do we do with all these feelings? I do some organizing for the Muslim community in Southern California and for the interfaith community. So I've been reaching out to people who are a lot more knowledgeable to figure out where do we go from here as a community and as individuals. So first, of course, self-care is really important right now. So I want to encourage everybody to give space to the feelings that you are feeling. Give yourself the time to feel them, to identify them, to name them for yourself, and also for your vulnerable family members, if you have children or if you have elders that are feeling distressed or confused. Then after that, I encourage everyone to take this opportunity. I've noticed a lot of us have this impulse to quickly go, we all can identify injustice very quickly and readily, right? We know we can recognize something that's wrong, but we tend to immediately separate people, you know, that there are racists and there are non-racists. And I'm not a racist. I can't believe those people do such awful things. But the truth is, we're all people and we're all carrying some form of bias, and racism and white supremacy has touched each one of us in different ways. As a South Asian, my parents immigrated from Pakistan, and I understand that I carry some biases. Sometimes we might cover up those biases by saying, oh, I don't want my kids to play outside because I don't want them to get skin cancer. We all know what we're really talking about. I'm just speaking from my own experience, for my own self and my family. We don't like to be dark-skinned. Why is that? It's rooted in understanding white supremacy. So there's a great website through Harvard, Project Bias, if you want to understand implicit bias a little bit within your own self. Because if we don't all address it within ourselves, the cycle is going to continue. So I really believe that me keeping my kids indoors to prevent tanning feeds into the system of oppression that leads to a police officer cutting off a Black American's windpipe. So we each have to do our part. And sometimes it's really difficult. You might find things within yourself that are ugly. Two, educating ourselves. African Americans were the first group of people that started articulating what Muslim American looks like, right? Immigrant Muslims start coming in much later, mostly in the 20th century. We are now obviously learning that of the initial slaves that were brought over from Africa, 15 to sometimes, the numbers are different depending on who you refer to, but 15 to 20% of those slaves were Muslims. So encourage your family to learn the stories of Yaro Mahmoud or Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. These stories are available. There are original writings from these Muslim slaves that were brought across in the slave trade. And understand how Black Muslims started carving out Muslim America in the 20th century, the story behind the Nation of Islam, 5 percenters. And then maybe we can be a little bit more reflective about how, as immigrant Muslims, we've played into this. A lot of our families migrated in the 70s, and we came here and without understanding the race history in the United States, not understanding where we fit in. A lot of us looked around and said, well, I'm obviously not Black. I have education. I have some money. I must be, part of the whites, right? And when we drove through neighborhoods like Oakland, we locked our doors because we were told by society that bias was fueled, that Black communities are not safe for us. So that's the role we've played. And only during 9/11 did some Muslims wake up partially to go, oh, we thought we were one of you. Maybe we're not. So it's really worth spending some time to understand the history of Muslims in America, Black Muslims in America, and how we fit in. And understanding the two conceptions of America, right? There's the one idea of America that says, and I'm sorry, I'm being very specific to the United States because that's where this is acutely happening. There's one model that says that to be American, you have to eat American, you have to look American, you have to abandon anything that's not American, which is essentially white culture. And then the other model says, no, the plurality model. So we need to spend some time to understand. I suggest a book, A Different Mirror by Takaki. It's a multicultural history of the United States. There's also a really good resource. Mashallah, now there's some great Muslim organizations that are doing this work. One organization I recommend is Muslim Arc, and I'll share their video at the end. Once you've educated yourself and kind of given space to your feelings, whether it's because you feel obliged to answer Allah's call for justice in the Quran, or maybe because you care about the well-being of all human beings, or maybe it's from a place of self-interest. You're worried about your own kids and their place in this country. The next thing to do is to become an ally. Become an ally to the Black community, to the Black Muslim community. And remember, this is not about us. We are not the center of this conversation. So I would suggest calling your Black friends. If you don't have Black friends, that's something to think about given the large percentage of Muslims that are Black. Reach out to your Black Muslim community and ask how they want to be supported at this time. So for example, in Southern California, and I can actually share this, the local community here has articulated their 6 asks of the general Muslim community. And I'm going to put them up here because they're a great starting place for many of us. So last Jummah, there was this great kind of town hall Jummah service, and the Black Muslim community articulated these 6 calls to action. So as people, our place right now, as immigrant Muslims, as non-Black Muslims, is to be allies, not to be the center of the conversation, but to support the efforts by our Black Muslim community. So locally, these are the six asks. One of them is a call to action to call the Attorney General of Minnesota. 2, it's to draft a letter of solidarity. So that means calling out to your masjid to write a letter of solidarity with the Black community. 3, this Friday is supposed to be a day of outrage. So asking our masajid to give khutbahs or video statements condemning anti-Blackness and police brutality and racism. Number 4 is to commit your Muslim organization to engaging in training and education and dialogue, learning about anti-Blackness in the United States, understanding race and race-based issues. And there's 2 more here, culminating in July 4th, a Muslim ride out that they're going to do in California. So these asks are specific to the Southern California Muslim community. I encourage you to reach out to your local Black mosque or to your own Muslim mosque. If you don't have a mosque where you can support these efforts, gather a group of people and just make it happen. So that's what I really wanted to share. And I wanted to show everybody this website. So this group is Muslim Arc. Arc is Anti-Racism Collaborative. And I'm gonna pull up this video here.
What world do we want our children to grow and play in? Do we want them to grow in one where they have to be aware of the racial inequities that surround us today? We as a collective are responsible for addressing these issues that will dictate their upbringing. Muslim Arc is here to facilitate that discussion in the most effective way. In 2014, during Black History Month, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, known as Muslim Arc, officially launched with the hashtag being Black and Muslim that trended globally in 7.5 hours and garnered international media attention. Inspired by Islam's egalitarian message, Muslim Arc's leadership team utilized digital media to connect educators, scholars, and community leaders to uproot racism.
So this is one example of a group you can reach out to learn more. So Jazakallah khair, Jawad. Thank you for letting me take your time and pulling the Baji card.
Thank you very much. No, those were very profound words. I think two of the things that I really like that you said are, one is, I would boil it down, at least some of what you said, to implicit bias and empathy. From implicit bias, I would say that I also like to push back against that idea that we're not racist, racists are bad. But we need to understand that we all have implicit biases. Even if you're buying something on, they've done studies on this. If you see a white hand selling a product on eBay versus a black hand selling the same product on eBay, all things equal, we would more likely click on the one with the white hand. So we all have this implicit bias. Within our South Asian community, let's be honest, we have explicit bias as well, but all of us have implicit bias. And finally, the second point is empathy. I think we can fall into the model minority myth. And, especially in the United States, at least South Asians, we are generally tend to be pretty well off. And so we can't empathize that much with so you even hear some ideas like, oh, even, we came to this country, quote unquote, nothing, and look how far we've come, and look at those Blacks and Hispanics. Why can't they just get their act together? Well, that's not quite true. We didn't come to this country with nothing. We all came with, we come on H-1B visas. Let's be serious. There was an immigration pattern. So the educated were coming. Whereas if you look at our South Asian community, like Pakistani community in England and in other parts of Europe, you can see that we are facing a lot of the same problems that the Black and Hispanic community faces in America. So I think that's important to point out so that we get some empathy. It's hard to empathize with people who look different than us, but look, we have the same exact situation in other parts of the world. Look at Palestine, look at Muslims in Europe. Try to put yourself in the shoes and see how you would feel. So I think those two things, watch out for implicit bias and try to gain empathy. Those are the two things that I would say, but I think we'll call it a day from there. Thank you so much for those words, Saradeen, and let's call it a day now. Thank you so much.